photos here. Tree came down, digging out the slab for which everything is built on top of. That's all 5,000 PSI concrete, a little bit of rebar in there, and it's all formed out. All the form boards are nice and level, so I had a nice level base to start with. Building up the blocks a little bit. This is a little bit difficult for me. This is my first time doing block work, so it wasn't really second nature to me, and it was something that, definitely looks easier than it is. When you're experienced, I'm sure someone can do this with their eyes closed. For me, what you're seeing in this picture took me the better part of a day to do and start to lay out. Although, as I went on over the course of 8 months or so, I actually got pretty decent at it towards the end. This portion of the oven, or the fireplace rather, was something that if I could do it again, I would have done differently. And what you're seeing here is basically I formed out the firebox and poured it with concrete, and then I applied the thin fire brick to this form as if it were like a veneer. I basically applied it like tile. And looking back, I would have done this at a full fire brick. I wouldn't have any other masonry touching it. The intent was to make it easy, but now I'm realizing that there's probably a difference in thermal coefficient between the fire brick and the refractory mortar and the poured concrete that might cause the brick to pop if it was ever under a high heat circumstance. So that's something I definitely would have changed. But I did a pretty decent job at it. The brickwork looks pretty clean. You can see in this photo I'm propping up the thin brick with some planks, a little bit of brick just to hold that adhesion until it fully cures. And starting to brickwork a little bit. What you're seeing here with the herringbone brick on the floor, this is the tunnel that runs in the back of the oven. So this is basically an inaccessible area once the slab's poured, and it would have been very difficult for me to do this brickwork later. So I'm doing it now while it's open, pulling some string lines and taking some measurements as I go. This is basically a little rough out of what the Rumford flue, which is cut, looks like on the lintel. So as I scroll through these photos, I cement them in, and I start to build the brick up on either side for the chimney flues. This is building up the brick on the walls and the wood storage area a little bit. And as I scroll through, you'll see I set the angle iron for the two edges where the slab is spanning from the front structure to the rear supporting wall. And right here in this photo, and this is pretty important, I think, you can see I put some extra angle iron here. I also have some ceramic insulation and tinfoil on top. And the reason I did this was the Rumford flue tile is really supposed to act solely as a smoke diverter. I didn't want to put any weight or pressure on this. So I'm essentially using that ceramic insulation and tinfoil to kind of air gap it from the slab above it. I didn't want to have any undue pressure. So I made sure there was about a 1/2 inch to an inch of clearance. If it wasn't air, it was going to be that ceramic insulation, but I didn't want any hard points to touch and potentially crack those two tiles. This is forming out the main slab for underneath the oven. I have a nice big piece of 3/8 inch AZAC board underneath or over the tunnel. So when I pull that, it actually provides a nice, smooth, almost polished finish that no one's ever going to see. But I had the board laying around. I figured I'd use it up. You can also see that I built the fire brick for the two flues on either side above the elevation for the finished slab. So the back of that fire brick basically acts as a form in the front for when I pour it. So this is a slab all poured. You can see in the center there's a 3.5 inch recess. This is a recess for the vermiculite or perlite underneath the oven floor. And that's where all your insulation is. The heat for the oven is really retained in the floor, And without having that insulation, the bricks would either start to pop or lift with that thermal difference, and the heat would have just bled out and wouldn't be retained as well. So that's what that section's for. My front opening doesn't have any insulation. In that area, it doesn't tend to get too hot. The heat is really limited to within the oven dome area. This is pouring in that vermiculite mix. It has kind of a popcorn consistency to it, and when it's all mixed up, and it almost seems when you're first working with it, it almost seems like something that's very malleable is never going to cure. But if you give it about 24 to 48 hours, it actually dries very solid, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out there. So this is forming out or starting to lay out the floor. I elected to wet lay this, so I use refractory mortar. This is all wet laid right on top of the oven slab and the vermiculite underneath. One thing that's really important with laying these floors is to use a herringbone pattern or some kind of pattern that the edge of the brick is set at a 45-degree angle relative to where the pizza peel is coming in. If you have any perpendicular angles, you have all these straight edges, and when you're pushing your peel in, if a brick's uneven or lifted a little bit, the peel could catch and hit a brick, and this kind of helps mitigate that. So this is starting to build the front entryway. The inner arch is 1 inch smaller all around than the outer arch. Here I'm kind of playing around with how I'm going to 45-degree these bricks up to the flue. And now we're starting the dome. So this is the trammel tool that I use in the center. This is set up so I have a nice perfect radius. You can see some pencil marks on the floor. That's where I scribe my center point. And the whole oven's built around this radius. So I did a 40-inch oven. The height of the oven is actually 21.5 inches, not 20 inches, because the fulcrum point of the radius tool I was using was 1.5 inches off the ground. So when I did my oven openings, that 63% opening in the front was actually predicated off the height, not the true radius of the oven. In circumstances like this, the height's a little bit more important than the width. So it's not a true perfect dome. It's really a semicircle with a 1.5 inch extension on the bottom. But moving forward a little bit, starting to build up some of the courses, plenty of cardboard underneath. The refractory mortar is a pain to clean and get off, and having this all duct tape in the bottom is a lifesaver. Just let the mortar fall, pick it up later when it's all done. And this whole process probably took about 5 days or so. The dome isn't clean at all on the outside whatsoever. You can see the brick is also a little rough, and that's because I just chipped them in half with a hammer. People who are trying to mortar over and make this an aesthetic thing would have a pretty tough time trying to render over what I did here. But the way I built my oven, this was all getting encapsulated. It didn't really matter anyway. So starting to build up a little bit. These final courses get extremely tough. If you go around YouTube and see people building these domes, you'll pretty much see everybody say the same thing. Once you start to get onto those last few courses, these bricks just have the tendency to want to fall back in. So at the end, you can see I have this little foam form that I made, which might not have been the best idea. And you can see some pictures on the top of the dome. It starts to get a little rough, but but it definitely sped things up a little bit. You can see here too the initial flue coming out of the oven. I have a piece of 8x8 steel here. I caught this mistake before I went with it. I had it set for about a week and a half or so, and as I started to build up, I pulled it because I felt like this steel would have heated up, started cracking stuff. I elected to just do a 8x8 terracotta flue instead. This stage here, I'm putting my ceramic insulation on top of the oven dome. So this is all tied in with chicken mesh and some baling wire to kind of keep it all taut. And setting the flues right here, starting to build up some block. That form on the outside that you see is my first layer of perlite insulation. So I have a little 10-inch band of perlite insulation all around the perimeter. And I start to form and pour it, build my way up. Have some forms here. and just building it up in segments. At this point, I actually went from vermiculite to perlite. I'm told perlite's a little bit better. It seems to dry a little harder. Vermiculite has a little bit of a spongy consistency even after it's fully cured. And coincidentally, the perlite was actually cheaper to buy. So I kind of wish I went with that from the very beginning. But just covering up a little bit of the dome, building up, setting my lentil for the support in the back of the chimney. This is my keystone for the front. These 2x4s that you're seeing with all the screws sticking out on the left and right, these I use as reference points. So I actually, those screws all represent my top of brick elevation. So as I was building up here, I just would pull a string right across. Didn't have to worry about using a level. I really hate using a level for brickwork. I just find it very difficult. It tends to ride up on high spots. Using the line was a lifesaver to me, and it was something that was really helpful. A little underside look of the flue diverter. There's the inside of the oven opening. And here's where we're really starting to take off. So I'm really starting to get the brickwork done, building up brick in the front, starting to set the brick in the back of my chimney. Same thing, I have those forms with all the screws in them. And you can see right here how my string line's used. Looking down, building the flues up a little bit. Around this point, I have some forms set up right on top of the oven so I could actually just stand up there and work comfortably. And eventually I started getting some scaffolding set up as I started to get about 12 feet in the air. This was working at night. A few days straight, I actually worked until probably 11 or 12 o'clock doing some of the brickwork here. In New Jersey, late October, it was starting to get a little chilly, and this wasn't the kind of project I wanted to run into the winter. So now was kind of crunch time to kind of finish everything up a little bit. So these are, now you're seeing the chimney is fully built. Those 4 posts on the sides of on all 4 corners of the chimney are for the chimney cap. So those are supports for that. Those are all made out of bluestone. And that's the cap set. The cap weighs about 380 pounds. I luckily had access to a machine to be able to crane it up. Doing it by hand, you would have required at least probably 5 or 6 guys to comfortably lift up there. And luckily I had the machine as a resource. So the oven basically looks done from the front. From the side, you can see I'm building up a little bit. Cheated a little bit. I actually started doing some of my curing fires, and I had some of my first pieces out of here before it was done. But as I went along, early November, started finishing up the brickwork and doing the lumber or the timber roof, which would eventually be covered with lead-coated copper. Unfortunately, I have a little crack here. This, I think, was caused by the 8-inch flue for the pizza oven was biased towards the rear of the chimney. And if I could do it again, I would have made the chimney a little fatter front to back. And I suspect that's the reason this crack got thrown in. But as we go over, as we keep going forward a little bit, I did 2 layers of 3/8-inch ply, which was kind of needed. I needed a thinner plywood to help bend the radius a little bit. And the only part of the oven which I didn't do myself and I hired somebody to do was the lead-coated copper roof. Thought about doing it myself, but it was really out of my wheelhouse. It was the one thing I wanted to leave to someone who's a professional, someone who does it every day, and they did an excellent job. There were 3 guys here for the better part of 12 hours putting this in, and they did a really great job with it. And that's pretty much that. You can see right after they finished, it started to get snowy here in New Jersey, and we've been cooking pizza, and we've been having a lot of fun with it since. So that's basically it. That's the build. I've been asked a lot of questions about the flues, how everything was diverted, how it was designed, and I sent some pictures to people, but I feel like having a video and explainer is a little bit easier to follow. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.